Hello and welcome to episode 87 of Retropower Uncut. And actually the camera is situated where Project Utah would normally be residing, but it's not because I've taken it to Dale's place, detailed by Dale, who's our go-to detailing guy, who's doing the final machine polishing and ceramic coating on the paintwork, and doing some coatings on other parts, engine bay, chrome, etc. To give it that final sort of depth of finish and protection to the paint. And that's given us a little bit of breathing space in here. Prior to that going over there, the day before, so it went over there yesterday, which was Wednesday. Tuesday, I was out on the road with Alex from DTA. We were doing a little bit of refinement on the map. It was pretty good, but we decided as a bit of a, well, A, safety, and B, just to refine it to that nth degree. We didn't have closed loop lambda functionality on it previously, so we decided to add that in. So we've got a lambda that lives permanently in the exhaust now, and that gives a signal to the ECU so we can put closed loop on. So once the engine's over a certain temperature, it switches over to closed loop control, and that just basically fine tunes the fueling. So when you're just on a cruise, if the lambda's just running, if it's running a little tiny bit rich or lean, and there's a maximum to how much we've allowed it to correct it. So if there's a massive problem, it won't necessarily correct it, but just for fine tuning that fueling, it just pulls the fueling in line. So we got that sorted, did a cold start, a little bit more tinkering on the cold start, and then we went out for a pretty long road test with Alex in the passenger seat, just monitoring things, making sure he was happy with everything, also data logging on the DTA, so we could go back afterwards and just look at all the data logs and see if we'd missed anything. So you can select what channels you want on the log basically, and look at a chart or a graph afterwards with all the channels. So you know, you have lambda, throttle opening, revs, etc., etc. You can have all the temperatures and things on there as well, so we could look at that afterwards. And that was looking really good actually. It's we ironed out a couple of little areas on it that weren't quite right. The very first bit of throttle off idle tended to get stuck into a bit of a cycle between being in idle control mode and not being in idle control mode. So when you're just using it along in traffic, it would tend to get into a little bit of a shunt. So we've sorted that out. And yeah, it was a really, really good road test. So really enjoyed it. That's now at Dale's. So Land Cruiser, I think we did show some footage of the doors and the back body sides being put on last week. We've actually started mounting up the panels. The back doors will be going on soon. Not because we need them on at this point, but because we don't want to put them down on anything, and we haven't got enough panel racks to hold. There's so many panels on this thing. We haven't got enough panel racks to hold all the panels just for storage, because we need them for the body panels for the next project, which we'll see shortly, which is going into paint. So we've actually temporarily mounted them on the car just because it's the safest place, because these have a visible painted finish on the inside and outside. If you lay them down on the inside or outside, you run the risk of getting a bit of an imprint from whatever you've laid them down on. The hinges at the moment are just the original hinges, although we are doing our own billet machined hinges. But the footprint on these, we should double check this, the footprint's slightly smaller than the ones we're doing, so there's any marking we'll get from these hinges will be covered by the new ones. And speaking of billet parts for this, we had some bits back from anodizing this week. So the machine top cap for the heater fan casing came back from anodizing. Just trying to think what else was on the batch of anodizing. Oh, the piece we've made to go on the engine to hold the idler, which allows us to delete the power steering pump. That's come back from anodizing. And I think we had a couple of bits for the Morris back, the interior door handles. That was something else. I know I'd forget this. Jamie, what did we get back?
Centre-lock wheel.
Ah, yes, the nuts for the wheels. So there's a cap that goes onto the split rims that are on the Morris, and it has effectively a machined nut which makes it look like it's a centre lock fitment, although it's not. So they've come back from anodizing. And what was the other thing?
The number plate light.
Oh yes, the number plate light / reverse camera mount for the Morris, which is a part that George designed, goes onto the boot lid and houses number plate light in the top, and then there's like a little orifice in it for the reverse camera to look through, and it's got O-ring grooves on it that seal it from any water ingress into the boot and stop water getting into the camera. So that's back from anodizing. You also notice a bit more of a move around. The Manta is now lurking under this cover. The guys finished off all of the wet sanding and buffing of the paintwork on that, and they did the satin black details at the same time. So there's a lip around the spoiler, the window and slash door apertures are painted satin black, and then there are loads of little aluminium trims that sit, the gutter trim, and then they sit all the way around the window apertures. So they've all been stripped and prepared and painted satin black. So that really transformed the look of that. I mean, it's been looking quite good lurking around here, but it looks absolutely amazing. When I saw it sort of under the lighting in the prep area, looked great. I can't wait to see that with the actual proper wheels on it now, because it's been lurking around with standard narrow Manta front wheels and some Weller steels on the back for far too long. So I can't wait to see the proper wheels on it. Mustang. Adam's beavering away in there at the moment. Doing the aircon fitment. So originally this did originally have factory aircon, which is like a self-contained unit under the dash, which is actually additional to the normal heater blower arrangement. And we've essentially just replaced that with an aftermarket unit, which takes up exactly the same space. Looks very similar, four sort of chrome bezels on the front of it for the outgoing air. It's a unit that Vintage Air do, so he's in the process of mounting that. Once that's mounted, that'll allow us to complete the refrigerant lines on the inside of the car. We've done those as far as the bulkhead at the minute, so that's gone well. Last week he was just doing the parcel shelf, so he's done the vinyl wrapping on the parcel shelf now. That looks great, looks really in keeping, and we've got the rear quarter cards in now, so actually the back of the interior's buttoned up. Just need to get the glass in there. The doors are now going together finally for the final time. They've been an absolute battle, but the final sort of issue we were having was that the channel at the back that the glass rolls down into has like a kind of felt material, but it's a bit weird. It's got a very heavy woven grain to it as they came from the manufacturer, and we were having a problem with the frame actually snagging that material and sort of pulling it down and bunching it up and then making the window go really tight. So we've taken those out, stripped them down, put a different felt material in there that's much smoother and got less of a grain to it, which seems to have solved the problem. So those doors are pretty much at the point we can get the door cards in now, and they're done. And then I think the instrument panel should be coming, if not next week, then the one after, and then that really is the keystone that then allows us to get everything done on the inside of that. So that's where we're at with that. Jim is doing lots of measuring and probably swearing in between measuring. He's been doing the diff builds for the Land Cruiser. So we completely stripped the differentials apart, inspected everything. Crown wheel and pinions on both were good, so we've retained those. Obviously replacing the bearings and seals as standard procedure. One of them went together with the original shims in it. Bolted all that up with the shims, torqued it up, and we got the correct turning preload on the pinion bearings. First time with the original shims. Second one we thought was going to be less straightforward because the shim that was in it had split and had obviously been spinning on it on the pinion shaft. So we suspected trauma there. So we made a few variations of thickness of spacer and just trialled them until we got one that gave us the right turning torque. So both diff now looking good, correct turning torque on the pinions. Jim painted up the teeth on them to make sure the contact pattern between crown wheel and pinion looked good, and that's all looking fine. So they're ready to go back in the casings. And then while he was on differential build duty, he's doing the MX5 diff for the Morris. Now on that one, literally everything is new, I think. So we've got new crown wheel and pinion as well, isn't it? Yeah, so new crown wheel and pinion, new diff, obviously all new bearings and seals. So I suspect that one's probably going to be more traumatic. And it's also of the type, whereas on the Land Cruiser one, the shim isn't behind the bearing on the pinion shaft, so it's dead easy to take everything apart, change the shim, put it back together, tighten it back up. I think on the MX5 one, I'm right in saying the shim is behind the bearing, is that correct? So it means that, yeah. So on those ones, it's a lot more difficult because the bearing's basically pressed on after the spacer. So usually the procedure there is that you use a bearing that's definitely the same thickness of the one you're going to use and grind out the middle of it so it just slips on. So you can do basically a dummy mock-up build and adjust the spacers by easily removing that bearing, and then once you're happy with that, then put the final bearing on and press it on. But yeah, with it being, I think, aftermarket diff, crown wheel, pinion, everything, I'm already predicting trauma. So let's see how that goes. Also on the Morris, speaking of trauma, we decided to do a final mock-up build of the electric window mechanism, the mock-up window we'd done for the single piece glass, and the held fire on painting for exactly this reason. We wanted to do a final fit up to make sure it all fitted perfectly with the actual seal in the door shut, and we are having a few issues. Getting the glass to come up perfectly into the frame at the top when the frame is pushed out by the seal at the top is giving us a few complications. When Stu did the mock-up during metalwork, he had some slightly different seals in there, and they were actually, I don't think they replicated the force that we've got now quite right, so we might change the seal profile. We've pulled the runner in very slightly at the bottom, the sort of front glass runner, to get the angle of the glass slightly more out at the top, because it's just only by sort of, we're talking like millimetres, it's probably 3 millimetres too far in at the top, but it just means it kind of catches the side of the door frame as it's going in, and you can like put the lightest amount of force on it and it'll go up into the channel. But obviously plastic bends and glass doesn't, so we're trying to iron everything out and get it perfect in the plastic, so when we've actually got a non-flexible glass window in there, it should all work correctly. So a little bit of trauma there, which we hopefully wouldn't have, but it's being resolved. Fuel tank, Adam, I think last week actually we saw him just starting to make a cardboard mock-up fuel tank, because we were just trying to check, we knew what would fit in there, but we were trying to check that you could actually fit it into place, because that's a classic mistake, is designing something to fit in a certain space, and it will fit there, but it won't go through the aperture that allows you to get it there. So we've done some revisions on the fuel tank. We also originally we were going to have the fill on the top of the tank coming straight out of the filler neck, and had a couple of concerns there. One was that we'd have to get the alignment of the two parts extremely good before the tank was made, which would be quite tricky, and there'd be no room for error or misalignment because the link pipe between the filler neck and the tank would be so short. And then we were also worried, because it's going to be a foam filled tank, to avoid too much fuel surge. We were worried that the sort of splashback off the foam would click the trigger out on a forecourt pump. So we've actually dropped the neck down to being on the side of the tank, quite near the bottom, and then we'll put large vents in the top of the tank to the top of the filler neck to vent air out as you're filling it, but the actual fuel goes in near the bottom of the tank now. So that's ready. There's a drawing there literally awaiting my final okaying on that. But that's getting there, and then John's just working on the wiper motor installation. So it's the old school Lucas wiper that has like a rack that runs in a tube, little gears on the wheel boxes as they call them, which are the spindles that operate the wipers. So we're just forming the actual tube that leads the drive rack, as I call it. I don't know if that's the official name, but leads that up to the wheel boxes. And so that should be permanently installed pretty soon. The instrument arrived today. I've been looking forward to that. So the main instrument pack, if it goes in the centre of the dash, it's got speedo as the main thing, and we've got rev counter, oil pressure, coolant temperature, fuel level, and volts, I think it is. All on the one unit from Classic Instruments, and it's actually one of their standard format gauges. We modified the dash, the aperture on the dash, to be slightly bigger than standard to fit one of their standard instruments. So they've done their usual fantastic job of that. Very efficient, great company to work with as always. So yeah, we're kind of on that countdown to getting everything together on the interior. I've just ordered the material to do the door cards, so as soon as George has finished doing the mock-up build on the door window mechanisms and they've been taken apart for paint, we can start patterning up and doing the door cards and the rear quarter cards. Dean's working on the carpet at the minute, so all of the different parts are kind of taking shape, and they should hopefully come together fairly swiftly once we've got to that stage. The clipper, we're going to take that off the ramp soon. We were working on the gearbox mount. We swapped the gearbox mount to get some more clearance on the steering rack and locate the engine a bit more securely. And then we've got the brake caliper brackets and carriers back from plating. I think the calipers are just being rebuilt at the minute for the front brakes, and that will complete the brake system completely then. The brackets for the servo are just being painted, and the fuel system is pretty much finished now as well. So that's almost at the point we're going to get it off the ramp now and do the dreaded soft top build. So wish us luck on that. I think Adam's volunteered for that. I have no idea why. It sounds like one of the most traumatic upcoming jobs. So that's where we're at with that. Project Norman, the E-Type, which is lurking over there, that's why I'm walking this way. The throttle bodies finally arrived. I don't know if I said this last time, but we've been waiting an eternity for them because UPS delivered them to the wrong address the first time, and that was the only set that Genvi had in stock at the time. So we've been waiting for them to cast new manifolds and machine the new manifolds for the new set, which just arrived the other day. So, you know, it's an absolutely gorgeous setup where you have these kind of crossover inlet manifolds, little throttle bodies that sit 6 each side. So the next thing we're going to do is get them offered up on the car, and we can start designing the things that we've got to design around that. So we're going to do intake plenums that give a cold air feed. It's something that I've seen neglected on most of the E-types I've seen with that setup, which seems like a terrible idea to me because there must be a huge amount of heat build-up in that E-type engine bay. Essentially, the only air feed into the engine bay is through the radiator, so the general engine bay temperature is likely to be very high. So what we're doing is we're going to design some really nice looking plenums that sit over those intake trumpets, and then we're using the cold air feeds that used to be a footwell air feed, which actually go each side of the radiator, and there's some like structure in the inside of the bonnet that feeds it. We're going to repurpose those to feed cold air directly into our air boxes, so we get a decent cold air feed to the engine. So yeah, getting those throttle bodies in and starting to design some engine bay components is next on that. Whilst I was talking about the clipper brakes, it reminded me that we've had a load of plating back today. A lot of it is for the transmission for this. So I talked about the Toyota Auto box that's being rebuilt. We've already stripped and bead blasted the casing, and that was all the exterior fasteners for that transmission coming back from zinc plating. So all of that lot can now go back to, I think it's Midland Auto Transmissions in Kettering, who are going to now do the final build-up of that transmission. What else was in that plating batch? I don't know, nothing. I think I can't think what was on it, so we'll just hand over to Nat at that point and see what's been going on the other side. And I'll catch you next week.
Right, well, hello folks, and thank you, Cal, for the handover, and here we are in the metal shop again. I've not actually been in here that much this week. I've been sat at my computer working on parts for this. Been doing quite a lot of CAD work. Well, basically started the week on Tuesday and we're now on Thursday, and I've basically just been solidly doing the CAD work for the rear suspension on this, and I've had a little bit of a setback in that as usual, assumptions catch one out, and I basically worked on a very lightly modified version of the design that we did previously for Gordon Murray's car. However, the complication with this particular car is that the intention is to run 15-inch wheels, and 15-inch wheels can easily tend to look too big on a Mark 1 Escort if the ride height isn't set correctly, and they do need to run quite low and the wheel arches be extended for 15-inch wheels to look correct. So that's what's happening. If you look on on this car's Facebook page or look online at Retropower Project 1 Escort, you'll find it, and you'll see a rendering of it which shows the general appearance we're going for. But to achieve that appearance, we need to run the car quite low, and to achieve that ride height, we actually need, realistically, to move the axle centre lines up within the car. On the front, we're not quite sure yet, but we may need to run a dropped spindle affair on the front yet to keep the suspension geometry reasonable and run that ride height. We're not quite sure on that yet. There's a little bit more design work to do there yet. But on the rear end, it necessitates me fitting the cradle that I've designed, that I'm in the midst of, well, pretty much finished designing, but it necessitates that to be fitted slightly higher in the car, and I'd made a little boo-boo of not having enough clearance. I'd done the mounts as per the previous one that we did, and it's a little bit too wide to go between the chassis rails. Previously it was fitted just below the chassis rails. This one's going to be raised by 45mm or so it's actually going to sit further up between the chassis rails, and so it needs the mounts moving in, which typically are the first part I did in the whole CAD drawing, and it does affect the CAD model quite a bit. So anyway, that's the next little tweak section. But basically, other than a couple of bits like that, the CAD model is pretty much there. I'm drawn in such a way as it enables me to extract all the parts drawing now and then all of the sheet metal parts, I can now automatically generate all the files I need for the CNC plasma, so I can cut all of the brackets required, not all, the vast majority of the brackets required can now be cut for that installation. All the tube lengths will be known, the exact detail of all the tube fish mouths are known, which means that they can then be used to generate the cut profiles for the ends of all the tubes. Well, we won't be CNC cutting the tubes, but we will be able to easily generate the exact drawings for the fish mouths on the ends, which makes doing the tube fits in the jig much easier. Obviously then I've got to I need to make the jig for the cross tube bushing alignments on that rear frame, and I need to make the jig for the rear lower wishbones as well. So I've got to make a couple of jigs for aligning things during welding. But they're the sort of next stages on that. But yeah, the CAD work's progressed until about an hour and a half ago. The CAD work had progressed very, very well. We just had a little bit of a setback there to sort out. In parallel with that, Tom's not here today, but Tom has been getting on with, he's been doing some other jobs as well. He started the week finishing off a little bit of work on the Camaro. However, he then moved on to the roof on this. For anybody unfamiliar with the structure of a Ford Escort Mark 1 and Mark 2, I believe is the same. The gutters, I'll run around the side so I can sort of gesticulate and explain. The gutter sections here are a separate piece, a separate pressing, which is welded, it is spot welded originally to the underside of the A-pillar up here, and then it switches and it's spot welded to the top side of the body side underneath the roof skin, all the way down there. Once they're fixed in place, it's a one-way street in terms of fitting the roof that they're on. Then you can't, if there's an error in the fit to the roof, you're stuck because you can't do anything about it. So what we elected to do is we were going to have to plug weld these gutters on anyway, not spot weld, because you can't spot weld them once the body side is attached to the inner body side. And we weren't replacing the inner body side because they were in good condition, and I didn't want to fit the gutters to the outer body side until we could trial the roof on. So there's a bit of a knock-on chain of events there. So what we elected to do was drill and rivet these on with small 1/8 rivets to the body side, which then enabled the roof to be fitted over them to check that the fit was okay and to make sure everything lined up properly and to verify that everything was good. And then what we can do is, because there's room for the rivet stubs, the pop rivet stubs to fall out, go down the pillar, and we can extract them all from the bottom of the pillar so they're not going to be rattling around in the shell anywhere. It means we can then drill the rivets out and plug weld the hole, drill another rivet out, plug weld the hole, and so on. And we haven't put rivets at every plug weld. We'd probably put a rivet every 3 or 4 plug welds along the gutter. It means we can then plug weld all the rivet holes up when we plug weld the gutters on. By plug weld, again, just a bit of background information, most people will know what I mean by that. I mean using a MIG welder some people would call it a puddle weld. I think the Americans would call it a puddle weld possibly. Basically where you have it's commonly used in car restoration as a substitute for a spot weld, where by those who don't possess a spot welder, and also in places where it's impossible to replicate a factory spot weld due to the sequence of assembly not being the same during a restoration, or where it's impossible to get in because you haven't got the right arms for a spot welder, which is often the case with us, is that we may not necessarily have the arms that can do the right reach. So the plug weld is an alternative where you drill a hole through the upper layer of sheet metal that you're attaching and not a hole through the lower layer. Clamp those 2 layers together, and then you MIG weld up the hole, and that fuses to the upper layer around the periphery of the hole and fuses to the lower layer in the centre of the hole and joins the 2 together by virtue of that. So that's how the gutters are now attached. So that's what Tom's done. He's got those aligned, trialled the roof on them, made sure everything fits, clamped everything in place, made sure that was verified that was all good with the gutters riveted in place. He's then plug welded them, removed the rivets, plug welded up the rivet holes, extracted all the bits of rivet, and then roughly clamped the roof on. And we're now at the stage of getting the corners of the roof to fit, which is a little way off. The fit to the pillars isn't perfect. To the manufacturer's credit, they were never perfect on the original cars. If you look at most for Mark 1 Escorts, there's quite a lot of hammer work been done in the screen corners. I don't think they ever fitted particularly well there anyway, so I don't think that's unusual for the aftermarket panel to be in that situation. We've got some work to do refolding part of the flange in the back, in the top corners of the back window where it doesn't quite, the profile's slightly wrong there, nothing too major. And a bit of work getting this all flush, because once this is in, that joint is brazed, and then that needs to be able to be filed flat there, or sanded flat originally in the factory, ground flat. But we'll file that, and then we'll probably put a little bit of lead in as well just to finish those joints off. But it needs to be pretty damn close there. So we've got some work to do there. Going back to previous, I think we mentioned it previous week, these are left open at the minute. I'm probably going to replace the ends of this scuttle panel with a different one, because these are the wrong shape. These don't fit, so this needs to be remade, either remade or replaced with an alternative one on the end, just the end sections where the dotted line is. That the profile there is wrong. And interestingly, then moving on from that, I think that's covered everything on that. Oh, and so James reminded me of a very, very important point, which is the engine. We've also collected, I don't know if we touched upon it at all last week, probably not. We've now also collected the mock-up engine for this car, which means there's another round of work that we can get on with. Both of the two Mark 1 Escorts that we're currently going to, well, currently with this one, very soon with the other one going to be building, they're both going to be powered by the same power plants, both Ford BDG type engines, both built by Sherwood race engines, and they'll both be, you know, circa 270-ish horsepower, 2.1 litre BDG, tri-sumps obviously, direct coil ignition, fuel injected, drive-by-wire throttle. Quite a lot of, there'll be pretty nice power units, and we've picked up a mock-up one which has got the dry sump pan on, the block, the head, empty head, dry sump pump, various, all the key bits that stick out of the engine are on there, so that we can then attach that to the gearbox and get that in the car to trial it. Viewers who are fresh to this or can't remember the previous what we've said in previous episodes, we're using a Mazda gearbox in both these cars. May seem a bit of a strange choice behind that engine, but it's a very deliberate choice in that these are chiefly going to be road cars, quite high performance road cars, but road cars. Hence the independent rear suspension choice, and hence the gearbox choice, in that we want a synchromesh gearbox for these. And the reality is there aren't that many synchromesh gearboxes that are relatively easy to fit, that are relatively compact, that are available new, and that are reasonably strong. And the Mazda one actually ticks all of those boxes nicely. It's what we use is an NC Mazda MX-5. So the sort of bubble wheel arch shaped Mazda MX-5 5-speed gearbox. In Gordon's car we use the 6-speed gearbox. That's a much bigger transmission, and it necessitates a huge transmission tunnel. And if I'm honest, the gear shift quality in it isn't that amazing. It's okay, it's reasonable, but it's not amazing. Whereas the 5-speed is a really nice gear shift. You know, everybody praises a Mazda MX-5 5-speed gearbox for its gear shift. The ratios are nice. It's a strong gearbox. There's guys putting 350 plus horsepower with turbo MX-5s through those gearboxes. We've got several customers using them way beyond what their design intent ever was, with no problems at all. They're cheap to buy brand new, you know, they're somewhere in the region of sort of £1,300 plus VAT, I think, brand new, somewhere in that region, I can't remember exactly. And what we do, what I'm going to do in these cars is exactly the same as what we did in the Morris Minor, is and we've, to that end of, over behind camera, there's actually two more gearboxes that I've bought, just very cheap ones. What we do is we take the NC MX-5 rear piece of the casing off. The gearbox basically splits into 3 casings. I'm going to remove the rear casing and replace it with an NB or NA, I think they're quite similar, but I'm using NB MX-5 rear casings. And there's a few pluses there. The rest of the gearbox is brand new. It's just literally just the outer casing. We'll bead-blast that. It'll all look like a new casing. The benefit to that is it has the provision for a speedo drive, electronic speedo drive, whereas the NC gearbox uses the wheel speed. NC installation uses wheel speed sensors for the speedo. The NB has a speedometer drive built into the gearbox, or an electronic speedometer drive, and the drive gear for that from the NB gearbox just slips straight onto the NC output shaft. That all just goes straight into place. And the other beauty with the NB gearbox is it has two potential gear shift positions. It has the original gear lever position at the back of the gearbox, and those people who have watched the Morris build will have noticed I moved the gear shift, I forget what it is, it's somewhere 5 or 6 inches forward. There's a second position which is blanked off with a blanking plate on the top of the NB gearbox. That blanking plate covers an aperture which is exactly the same pattern as the gear lever installation on an NC gearbox. And what it means is that we can use an NC shifter on an NB gearbox in the forward position or an NB shifter in the rearward position, and either will work. You have to drill the selector shaft for a roll pin, but other than that, basically it gives you two completely distinct gear lever positions, which mean you can tailor the gear shift position perfectly in the car. It's just a really neat way of doing it with a brand new gearbox. The adapter from the NC gearbox onto, which is obviously a Duratec in the original Mazda, there's an adapter available. Obviously, if you're putting a Duratec in, then you can bolt it straight on. If you're putting it onto a Ford Zetec BDA crossflow type bell housing pattern, earlier Ford bell housing pattern, then there's an easily available adapter. So then that can be fitted to the adapter, fitted to the BDA, and we have a nice good gear shift quality, decent ratios, strong, available cheaply, brand new transmission, which is the route we've chosen to go on these two cars. So lots of waffle from me, but a bit of explanation there as to the background of why we've done that. Moving on from that, behind camera is the next Escort, which you saw arriving last week. Well, we've now, Richard's now stripped this, but kept it rolling, got it stripped to a rolling shell stage, so it's easy to keep out of the way. And it's in much better condition than that one was. Really surprising, because that one appeared a very original car, and actually was nowhere near as original as appeared, and even for an original car had a lot of messy parts, quite a lot of rust in it, little bits of rust everywhere rather than horrendous rust, just little bits all over the place, nothing horrific, just loads of little areas. And it also had quite a lot of accident damage, although it wasn't obvious because it was only very light accident damage, but it had put quite a lot of the suspension mounting points quite well out of place. This one has got a bit of obvious accident damage on the front, but I don't think it's moved anything suspension-wise very much. And in Mark 1 Escort terms, it's in unbelievable condition. You won't really see it on the video, and Jamie will have a few close-in shots, but basically the floor will reserve judgment till after blasting. But there don't appear to be any holes in it, and it doesn't appear, it's never been welded. There are no welded repairs in the floor at all. There's no welding on the chassis rails, and it's on original sills, and the sills have never been patched, which for a UK car, which this is unreal. I believe it's a two-owner UK car, but with no underside welding. In fact, I'm not even sure, I don't think there's any rot repair welding at all in the underbody. It's had this new rear scuttle fitted for some bizarre reason. I assume that must have had a rear screen changed and rotted through where it was damaged at the bottom. Looks like there was a bit of rust down here, and that's why it's had a scuttle changed. But other than that, I don't think there's any rot repair, any previous rot repair been done on the car at all. It's got a bit of panel damage in various places. The roof's a bit damaged, the quarters are a bit damaged. We will have to take the quarters off anyway, because to do the wheel arch modifications and to make sure that there's no trapped rust anywhere, realistically we're going to need to take the quarters off to make sure there's no rot trap. So we're going to take those off, but potentially, watch this space, because I'll probably retract all this once we've blasted it, but potentially we might be able to do a join on the quarters and not have to disturb the roof seams. We'll see how that goes. On that car there was rust in the roof gutters, which meant that we really needed to pull the roof off to make sure that was rectified. On this one, if rust-wise we don't need to remove it, I think we'll be able to panel beat the damage in the roof and just do the quarters below that. So that'll be nice if that is the case, because that'll be a little bit better. The other thing, another aside that hopefully everybody seems to like my rambles, interesting one. One of the reasons we wanted this car here at this point was as a reference, because we were chasing our tails a bit with the fitment of parts on that car. And one of the things having this car here has reminded us is just how slapdash the fit of panels on a Mark 1 Escort was as they came from the factory. Case in point being the roof gutter to A-pillar fitment. This gutter overhangs the windscreen pillar by 7mm more this side than that. and the spot welds on there are factory. They're completely original factory spot welds, and yet the gutter positions are 7mm different one side of the car to the other. So this side there's an enormous overhang, that side there's hardly any overhang. So my fretting over gutter positions on that and sort of worrying about 1mm either way in terms of the gutter positioning, I'm probably looking for something I'm never going to achieve, is what I'm realising there. But it's good to have this. It gives us a good guide. Although the panel fits are a bit knocked about and things aren't quite fitting where they ought to have done, because I think it's been thumped a bit, it gives us a good guide to the shape here. This isn't fitting how it should, but it gives us a good guide as to how the end of this scuttle should be, which is not like that one, and gives us a clue as to where to go on that. Interestingly, on this car, I suspect, although again we'll see after blasting, we may actually not need to change the scuttle, which would be interesting and nice not to have to do that. We'll see where that develops, but certainly current situation is, fingers crossed, we shouldn't need nearly as many panels on this one as we did on that one. So hopefully that's the case. Speaking of panels, hopefully in about a week's time we should be able to get some more panels for that car. After the wing debacle, we are going to try the bubble arch front wings. I know we've had some comments about them not fitting brilliantly either. However, my view was, well, they can't be any worse. So we're going to get a pair of the integral bubble arch front wings for that car and try those, because the final wheel arch shape on the front of that car is actually going to be quite close to the standard bubble arch. The rear arch is way different to bubble arches, but the front will be quite close. So we're going to try those and see, and sort of regroup from that point on. But as I mentioned last week, what we did discover is that it's definitely the wings at fault, not the car, having roughly trialled that one on. Somebody mentioned why not use that wing or find out what the source of that wing is. That wing, I believe, is a source that doesn't exist anymore, looking at how old it is, and it looks like it's been in the sea. It's certainly not usable. I was only just checking it for shape. It's certainly not one I'd be able to fit to the car, because half of it's dissolved. When you look close up on camera, it probably looked okay, but you could strain your spaghetti in it. So right, that's about where we are on that. I'll stop waffling on that, move over here. We've got some exciting stuff here, because Stu's been shaping again, which everybody likes, including us. Stu's been busily away with quarter and rear panel. Started on the sheet metal work there for a bit, just to get his head around the shape of things and where things were going to go. And then we had a bit of a conflab yesterday on the way forward in terms of finalising the design for the rear axle mounts, and then finalising how that was all going to tie into the rear structure of the car, and then working out how to do that with obviously we talked about the fixture set that's holding the axle in place, so you can see it better now because there's less car around it. But when we went through the process of how to locate how we're going to locate those chassis rails into this body shell, and then how we're going to tie that into the boot structure on here, and then how we were going to access all that with it necessarily, as it has to be, on the jig while that's done, we concluded actually working around the confines of the standard boot floor was a pointless exercise, because it's all in the bloody way, and most of it was going to have to be cut out anyway. The front of the spare wheel well it clashes with the independent rear end, so that needed modifying anyway. Both the sides need modifying, and really we want to tie the rails that pick up the rear suspension into the rail that goes all the way to the inner rear panel. So we concluded at the tail end of yesterday that actually that lot might as well come out. So Stu's removed it all now. I think he's pretty much there. There's a few edges to tidy up, but he's basically got all that lot out now. Pardon me, a hint of a cold, I think. But he's got all that lot out now. So the next stage is he's going to build the rails. I've got to plasma cut him a template out for the mount centres for all the bolt holes on the rear mounts, which we've got from a previous CAD drawing. So then he's going to start fabricating the chassis rails, fabricating the tie-ins for them. He's got a bit more metal to remove in there yet. Actually, that'll probably be half of tomorrow, removing that. But then he's going to start fabricating the rails, fabricate the tie-ins into the rear end structure, into the existing rail terminations on the back of the standard Mark II Escort. Mark II Escort. Mark II Jaguar. Tiredness, I'll put it down to that. He's going to fabricate the tie-ins to the back of those rails so that he can get that structure in, and then extend those rails all the way back to the inside of the rear panel, and then fabricate the boot floor inwards from there and outwards to the quarter panels. So that's where Stu's at with that really, but the other side to it is the enjoyable part, metal shaping part is he's made a good start on the quarter panel now. He's made a good inroad into that, but to finalise that he really needs the inner structure done here, because any slight movement on this lot from doing the inner structure will make a big difference to the quarter panel. So we really want to get that lot fixed firmly before he gets the quarter panels fixed to it. So that's the knock-on sequence of events going on there. That's coming together quite well now. Obviously that lot's come quite well apart now, but it will be coming together quite well now. And often you find this as a sort of as an aside again, if you're doing fairly heavy work on building cars, basically. Lots of people at home building cars. I'm quite sure there's plenty of people that watch us on YouTube that build cars in their own garages, and to varying degrees of the extent that we do. But I'm quite sure there's quite a few people doing it, and one of the things you find time and time again is, yes, it looks dramatic removing a lot like that, but actually an awful lot of the time you find it's far quicker, far easier, and actually a far better solution to remove a lot and then refabricate than it is to try and work around bits of car that are in the way. Bits of car that are marginally the wrong shape. You can spend an awful lot of time trying to sort of tweak things around to work around bits of car that are just slightly the wrong shape, rather than going, actually what it needs is a redesign to be this shape, remove all that, redo it properly, put it back into shape, put it back to where you need the structural strength, where you need the bits to be, and you've got a far better solution in much less time than trying to work around what was already there. And that's the case with this. Exactly, you know, the rear design wasn't particularly clever on one of these. It accommodated a fuel tank in a position where we don't want a fuel tank, a spare wheel well in a position where we only want to be able to put a space saver spare, which obviously wasn't really a thing when these were new cars. So there's just no point working around the constraints that are already there. So watch this one develop again next week. And moving on from that, we will swing by Steve in the body prep area. He's just doing a little bit of flatting off on some more panels, the last couple of panels for the Manta, but you'll notice a big Camaro shaped Camaro. It's an ARO at the end of it, so I always say it's Camaro, but hey ho, apparently it's a Camaro. You'll notice a big empty hole that's the shape of a Camaro in there, and that's because it's now in here. We've pushed on a little bit. Obviously you saw Tom doing that bit of work on the back edge of the front wings last week. We've still got a few tweaks to do around the front end. There's still a few bits to do there, but we're at the stage now where we want to get a coating of polyester spray filler basically on the car, so that we've got something to block back and get it all sort of one colour and give us a bit of a clearer approach in terms of the blocking work next. So then we can get all that blocked, and then we can revisit the front end fit, revisit the areas that we're not 100% happy with around there, and make sure that we are 100% happy with them. And that's going to involve the glass going in. Obviously that's not so simple on this because it's bonded in glass, but we will have to take the glass in onto rubber pads that simulate the bonding thickness. So then we can also fit the stainless trims, which I hasten to add have already been fitted once on this at the point of doing all the metal work, but they need fitting again to then verify the fit all around the windscreen, because those who know these cars will realise there's a stainless trim that goes across the bottom of the windscreen that actually is what holds the back edge of the scuttle panel in place, and also fills the gap between the top of the wing and the windscreen aperture and the wing and the bottom of the A-pillar. And basically none of it makes any sense or looks any good at all until the trims are in place. So they need trial fitting. So again, it's a bit of a chain of events that we're at the point now where realistically it needs the polyester getting on it, get all that blocked, or get that somewhere near, and then we'll do a mock-up fit of all of the trim parts, all of the cosmetic parts like the headlights, grille, and all those sort of things. Just a final sort of check before we start thinking about primer, that all of those bits actually fit. And I guarantee some of them won't, because such is the way with these cars. There's so many interdependent tolerances on these, even with a standard fitment. There's so many interdependent tolerances, all of which are very sloppily defined, because basically every 1/4 inch bolt has a 3/8 inch hole around it, and every 3/8 inch bolt has a 1/2 inch hole around it. And the tolerance stack up is just enormous. So there's so much scope for things to be in the wrong place, and it's quite a headache. So the plan is that once we've got the polyester on and add another little tweak with the alignment, we will then pin. We had already done this, but we're going to do it again because rewinding a long way, the car ended up having new doors, and that meant that our pinning of the original doors became irrelevant. But we will then roll pin the positions of the hinges to the pillars and the hinges to the doors. We'll drill and pin those when we know they're all in the right places, so that we've got a bit of a fighting chance of getting things fairly speedily back in the right places by using the alignment pins, because trying to just line them up with the bolts takes forever. You know, it's a very slow process. So if we can put alignment pins in and fixed length spacers and everything numbered and lettered as to where it all goes, it does massively speed up the reassembly process. So yes, at the back there we've got a pair of Porsche bumpers that belong to a Porsche 356 that we did a body shell restoration on somewhere around about when Noah had his Ark, I think. I think the owners decided to sort of carry on doing some more work on that project, and one of the things that never got done was the bumpers. So we've had those zinc metal sprayed and powder coated. We're now prepping and painting those for the final paint finish. So that's why they're lurking over there, because they're going to get some polyester on them as well, just to give them a bit of build to get things a bit straighter and flatter on them. And I think that pretty much sums up where we are at this week, and I'm going to sign off at that and see you all again in a week's time.